Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. So I'm Charlotte, not Glenn, and I have been asked to chair, but I think my role is incredibly minimal here. I want to say thank you to the 5 guests who we have, and Rebecca's sort of given us a list of those people, but I wondered if they could perhaps give us a little bit of an introduction to themselves, and then we're going to have a conversation about how effective can the role of the citizen in planning for the future of cities be. And I think it's going to be potentially something that our speakers, our guest speakers will touch on through some of their case studies, some of the work that they're currently involved in. How we can move from engagement to action, I think, is a key topic. How we can explore how democratic and participatory development has evolved, and how recent events and policies have shifted approaches to the future. So hopefully through pragmatic and tangible case studies. So if I could perhaps hand over to Helen to start on her introduction, please.
Yeah, so my name's Helen Graham. I teach heritage studies at the University of Leeds, but I'm part of this conversation because over the last few years, I've been working collaboratively with Phil Bixby on 2 public engagement processes in York, one related to the Castle Gateway area in York, which is the area around Clifford's Tower, and the other related to York Central, the area behind the railway station and the Railway Museum. And in both cases, we've been keen to try and find creative ways of expanding the notion of consultation way beyond consultation to be dynamic, responsive, and creating action in all sorts of ways. I suppose fundamentally to what we do is position that question really as a democratic question, the question of democratic innovation. And in the questions that we're going to be exploring today about the relationship between citizen action and the future of cities, the complexity of cities really needs also complex design of democracy in order to deal with how we can shape and shape the future in different ways. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Helen. Victoria.
Hi everyone. I'm Victoria Bradford-Keegan. I work on the Future Parks Accelerator programme. So working for both Heritage Lottery Fund, National Lottery Heritage Fund, and the National Trust. In that, I've been exploring what the future for urban green space and green infrastructure is with both those 2 organisations for a number of years now, maybe about 5 or 6. Which has kind of led us to the Future Parks Accelerator programme, which is a collaboration between Heritage Fund, National Trust, but also 16 local authorities and their various partners and some third sector organisations as well, who are the custodians of green spaces in 9 different cities, where we're looking at how we can put green infrastructure at the centre of civic decision making and place making to both enhance the cities themselves, but also the green spaces so that they can deliver greater public benefit. A big part of that is looking at how you can increase the range of people engaging with green spaces, but also potentially participating in formal and informal decision making about the future of those spaces and what happens there.
Thank you. Hi, Alastair. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you. So hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Alastair Parvin. I'm the co-founder of Open Systems Lab. We're a non-profit R&D company working on various types of systemic innovation for the built environment. So that ranges from forms of construction like WikiHouse, to work we're doing on digitizing and hopefully democratizing the planning system. And also we're looking at other projects, including a new form of home ownership called Fairhold. So you can probably read between the lines, there's a thread of democratization and digitization going hand in hand there, or trying to.
Thank you very much. And Irena?
Good evening, and I want to start with something a bit more intimate because it's Friday night and we're having a drink in our hand. So just to tell you that I was brought up in a family where social justice was discussed on a daily basis, and also the mechanism by which social justice can be best delivered. And the conclusion always was throughout my entire childhood that social democracy is the best system that we have for delivering social justice. And I think this topic of today's conversation is very apt because we have the social democracy in this country that we can actually even contemplate this discussion about what contribution we can make as citizens. So I've got because of this upbringing, I've got a bit of a strange career when I think about it, because I'm an architect by training. I was also a teacher for a while, but I also set up a startup called Mass Bespoke, which is about new construction methods, very much on the shoulders of WikiHouse, and also a community enterprise, a KIC called Leeds Love It, Share It, which is about creating new possibilities on a neighborhood level in Leeds. And all these things, strange as they seem, are completely connected, because to be an activist, you have to have something to say and understand how it sits in the framework of everything else. You have to have something to offer, and then you also have to deliver it. So all these different structures are to do with trying to combine all the different aspects of making a difference.
Great, thank you, Irena. Hi, David, over to you.
Hi. Yeah, well, some of you will have heard me speak about an hour ago. In terms of who I am, I mean, I think who I am was formed when I was in my 20s, when I was in the very awkward position of working for Manchester City Council as the local planner for Hume, and also being a resident of Hume and knowing all the community activists. And so I was in this sort of two sides of what was quite a fractious discussion at the time. And what we did as tenants in Hume was we created a housing cooperative, and we spent 10 years building a development which is now called Homes for Change, or in Hume it's called the Yellow Bricks, 75 apartments and workspace and a theatre and a cafe and artist studios and all sorts of things, all in one big mixed-use building, which I never ended up moving into because by the time it was finished I'd had kids and moved on. And as a result of that, I got a job at Urbed, and 30 years later I'm still at Urbed, still doing stuff which is inspired by that experience when I was a lot younger. And Urbed is a design practice, but it's also cooperative. It's also employee owned. It is for profit, but doesn't make any because we spend most of our time doing stuff that interests us. And we do all sorts of things, including straightforward master planning work. But at the moment we are working on the government's National Design Code, which is an incredibly stressful process, but hopefully one which will bear fruit soon. So that's me. Great,
thank you. I don't know who would like to kickstart the conversation tonight. Does anyone of our panel of 5 want to perhaps offer a way to start the conversation? David, do you want to perhaps, given that you were the last in, do you want to start perhaps talking about the role of the citizen now, perhaps, or how things have changed in your experience?
I was just distracted by Phil's comment of the concept of profit. Yes, it's a very theoretical concept, profit, as far as that's concerned. I mean, I think the issue of community engagement is a fascinating one, and one where a lot of rubbish can be spoken quite often. In the last session, so just ask the community. Well, I've worked in communities all over the place, and actually it's been the most enjoyable part of my job, doing community engagement. But I can tell you, for one, the community doesn't speak with one voice. The old people, who tend to be the people who get involved in active consultation, are not the same people as the kids that are stuck out in the playground, or the people that are stuck at home because they've got kids with no childcare responsibility and they can't get to the meeting, or the blokes down the pub who've got another set of views. And so communities of these amazing multi-headed, multi-opinionated places. And this idea that often permeates discussion of, well, just ask local people what they want and that will be right, is actually so much more complicated. And actually it's slightly disrespectful to talk to about communities in that way. So I think, I've always regarded the way we work with communities in the same way as I work with my doctor. I assume my doctor knows more than I do about my health, because my doctor, she's been trained to do that. She has professional knowledge, but actually she doesn't know about how I feel, which is my job to tell her that. And actually the issue is a respectful conversation between those two people, rather than she just saying, well, what would you like your treatment to be? Which is how many people treat consultation.
Could I throw it over to Victoria maybe to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I think it'd be this might happen. I think throughout the night there's going to be quite a lot of unanimity in terms of the response here. I was just thinking as David was speaking about how probably halfway through what you were saying about really needing to understand those varying views that you'll get from the examples that David gave, or whoever else is the community in that place, or that of that thing that you're asking them about, to really understand them and then try and take that and come back with suggestions or solutions. Because the other thing that I think happens is, and I think you described this really well, David, is that you're asking people to come up with ideas or to give you solutions to problems that they perhaps haven't thought about the solution. They understand the problem, they understand what they don't like or what they see as an issue, but to find the solution to that is not necessarily, can be, but not necessarily what everyone wants to do. What they want to do is to get it fixed, but actually they want the people that spend their lives doing this to come back with a range of things, having thought about what the issues that have been presented by themselves and by others. Actually are, some people want to get in there and roll their sleeves up and work out what those solutions are, but many people actually don't. They just want to have a choice and feel like their concerns, their hopes have been considered in the production of the suggestions that then they might get asked again about, or asked to comment on, I think. But I like your doctor example better.
I thought I was being controversial as well, but
Can I come in on that? Because I think while it might be true that you would like your doctor to know what operation you might need or what medicine you might need to take, I think people are experts in how they want to feel and what they want their bodies to be able to do. And so I think that's a distinction that we've been very keen to work with in the work we've done in York, where we've sought to work with people starting where they are, wherever they are, and in lots of different places, to talk about what matters to them and what they'd like to be able to do. And from that, work towards developing an open brief that then, in effect, the doctors or the planners and designers could then work with. But the key issue there is that the open brief needs to really have dealt with complex issues up front. Because what happens so often within these processes is that those complex issues are not resolved while they can still be stories and narratives and hopes and discussions and memories and all of that expanded sense of what that conversation needs to be. And they get pushed downstream and need to try and get fixed at design stage and at proposal stage. And at that point, we just fall into the biggest trap of consultation, which is to come back with proposals where everyone, the cynicism of, well, you've already decided what you want to do, just gets exacerbated. So I think there are some useful distinctions there about what people really do know about, which is their lives, what they want to be able to do, and bringing expertise in at the right moment to respond to those hopes. So I think that's a distinction I'd make.
Can I bring Irena in, please, to perhaps, I don't know, talk about the role as the expert or the facilitator in helping intervene or facilitate?
Yes, I think we're going to have a lot of metaphors tonight because really the most successful conversations I can think of, so collaborative, co-produced conversations, are when everybody's comfortable with the different roles. So there's absolutely no doubt that the combination of tacit knowledge that comes from knowing your place, It's tacit knowledge that people have. Anybody who's committed to the place where they live and cares for it has a invaluable knowledge of themselves, of the place, of others. But then when you blend this together with a knowledge of specialists, or many specialists, I would say, whether it's a specialist for local authority because they have this incredible network that's called local authority, and they know the policy, and they know where the money is, and they have experience and memory, deep memory of social issues. But also then your technicians, your architects, your designers. When you are brave enough to bring this together and appreciate each other's value as curators, as collective curators, that's very powerful. And when I look at people working separately, either architects delivering solutions or communities creating their own solution, I see communities ending up with huge rows about what is actually going to be done because everybody sees it differently. I see architects delivering solutions which last. We've already built buildings in neighborhoods which are being demolished now after 10 years. This is not a proud legacy of architects coming in, designing stuff. So I would always promote the collaborative co-production model where from beginning everybody is aware of each other's contribution and that they are not equal contributions, they are different contributions. And that's the strength of it.
Thank you, Irena. Alastair, would you like to contribute and pick up on the themes that I was talking about?
I think what I think is sort of worth thinking about here is that there are different kind of degrees or levels of civic power or citizen participation in cities, or as someone's quite reasonably raised, neighborhoods, any form of space. And with apologies for the abstraction, you could probably sort of break it roughly into 4 levels. So if you sort of imagine at one level, you've got kind of full paternalism / feudalism, which is everything is done to citizens in cities. Next level down would be probably consultation, which is like, we're going to do it to you, but we're going to ask you your opinions and ask for your inputs. And that includes real meaningful power, by the way, like voting. The next one you might, is a sort of blurry one, you could kind of call participation, or maybe alternativism, which you say, well, look, we kind of, this is the normal, but we're happy for you to do other forms of more civic powered and more community powered stuff over there, as long as it's this kind of slightly weird alternative thing on the edge. And then fourth would be kind of full on democracy, which is where actually it's not like you've democracy in the actual original meaning of the word demos kratos, i.e. you're literally, citizens have the actual power of ownership, like the actual power to set the planning rules, the actual power to do, they are the ones actually commissioning and building the homes and so forth. So now I'm not saying all of those are good and have their place, and all of them contain complexities, but there's obvious there's a kind of progression or journey that I think we're trying to go through in various levels. And I think we need to not kind of confuse them. The interesting point that we're at now is where arguably we're sort of at this kind of hitting this perfect storm where a whole bunch of old centralized industrial and institutional models are arguably failing us quite badly, both in lots of levels, ecologically, environmentally, socially, and so forth. At the same time, what are emerging are new ways of organizing that are basically the World Wide Web, for example, and tools that were unimaginable to the people who were first building those centralized bureaucracies. And so what's happening is that some of those kind of, if you like, those fourth layer serious full-on democracy of production and control are becoming much more possible and potentially able to step into the gap where the old centralized institutions and models are failing. So the really interesting, exciting stuff for me is happening where we're kind of going, now, wait a minute, let's move from sort of one level to level 2 to level 3, if you like, or even beyond that, where we go, no, this doesn't need to be a sort of alternative weird thing anymore. Actually, we can see that as the new normal, and that's some of the obviously the issues that are trying to be debated in the new planning white paper and lots of other areas, which is to what extent can you actually put serious power of ownership of control over planning rules, and literally don't consult people, let communities and citizens be the actual owners of the site doing the development. And I think, you know, that for me is the kind of, it's worth having these conversations within that spectrum.
Sorry, go on. I was going to say bring either David or Helen into that part, perhaps the planning aspect.
I was just going to say, when you said they were all they were all possible and potentially valid, I presume the feudalism one was excluded from that.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, paternalism's okay at moments, isn't it?
Well, you know, I mean, you know, what I was going to say was that it depends upon the circumstances, and the assumption of what you were saying was that it was increasing good the further you went up that 4-point scale, and it was better to have the greatest involvement. So when we were doing Homes for Change, we were the client. There were about 50 of us involved in it, and we chose the architects, and we acted as clients. Basically, it was being built for us. We got the money, we were paying for it. It was a community development. If I've got a scheme which I'm doing, which I'm thinking of now, where it's in an area where there's a desperate need for housing, it's a brownfield site, but the community around the site don't want it. Community around the site don't want new people coming into their neighbourhood. I think it's probably not a good idea to give them complete control of the development, because basically nothing will happen if that's the case. And it's always a big issue when you're dealing with a development which is going to be occupied by people who you can't consult because you don't know who they are, surrounded by people who are opposing it. And this is the reality day to day of what we mean by consultation. We try and win over the community. We try and say, well, what can we do to make it more acceptable to you? But we're never going to win them over, because actually they fundamentally oppose what is happening. So it's complicated when you actually get into the nitty gritty of doing it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, but of course, what you're talking about there is actually, it's going back to your point, as the community is not a homogenous beast, right?
Yeah.
And actually, we are talking about the frictioning rights between the community who are already there and the community who would like to be there.
Which needs to be mediated, because democracy doesn't.
Exactly, and that I think that's the important point, is that all of those layers. Yes, obviously, the inference of what I was saying is, I think we have an opportunity, and arguably an obligation, to actually start making full-on structural democracy the new normal, if you like. That's a meaning that's changed its meaning now, but you still don't, what still doesn't go away are all the same lessons, all the same issues of collaboration, of government, of governance, of disagreement, and how you manage and mediate those on the ground.
Victoria, do you want to come back in? You're unmuted.
I was just thinking about how you might apply this to parks, funnily enough, given that's what I do. I was thinking whether these are exactly the same issues or whether there's any differences, and broadly I think that, you know, so within a park as a physical location, you get the same tensions of communities and users, whether those are, you know, the proximate communities living in and around those green spaces, or whether they are people who have come to that place for another reason but are still, you know, the conflict that exists within those spaces is also interesting. And how I don't think I have any answers. I was thinking through whether the issues are the same, and I think they are.
Or dog walkers, which is always an issue in parks, because
dog walkers versus children versus footballers versus fishermen versus whatever. And people that live there and want peace and quiet to look out upon, and people that come there to exercise and jump up and down and shout and play music and all those other things. So no answers at this moment, but some similar issues, I think.
Part of the challenge, I think, is that we have lots of different means of democracy perhaps going on at once. And I think one of the challenges of evolving democracy at this point is to reconcile and work between those different kinds of ideas of democracy. So obviously what we have is a kind of classic representational democratic structure at the moment, where through elections people make decisions on our behalf, and in so many ways that has proven convenient way of managing democracy, and also flawed in terms of lots of the ways in which we want to work together to shape our lives. And I think from where we're at, but they do different things and they have different capacities. I think that's probably part of what we're getting at in this conversation. And I think one of the things that we've been really interested to think about is how you create a more systemic approach to democracy. Very interested in some of the debates that are happening in political science at the moment around deliberative systems, where you try and design something which can move from those small everyday conversations where people make sense of their lives and have hopes and have dreams and are talking when they're walking their dogs and all of the other parts of everyday life, which actually is where a certain kind of democracy is kind of happening. People are making sense of the world. They're making choices about how they want to interact with each other. They're coming up with ideas and ideas for how things can change. And how those kinds of conversations to start where people are with an expanded range of emotions and memories and hopes and dreams and imaginations can become connected into formal decision-making processes that exist within current representational democracy, and through that also enable more community action and intersect in relationship to more community-led activity, and this have a much more expanded range of a sense of what democracy is, which is about connecting up those different spheres in a way that can deal with the complexity of our cities and unleash collaborative action and collaborative change at all scales, from the kind of decisions that can only currently be taken by local authorities, right through to small groups of people who have met through the process, getting together to carry something forward. So I'm quite interested in how we evolve our sense of democracy from where we are through experimentation and through action to try and work out how these different traditions of democracy, participatory, action-led and representational, can start to fit together in new ways, and new things will come out of that ultimately as well.
Could I perhaps bring in the layer of how technological and digital changes have enabled new practices, methods, and is that perhaps a way of establishing that systemic shift that you talk about through technology and through digitization? And it might be worth bringing Irena and Alastair back in, perhaps to touch on their their work with that new technology and construction.
Okay, Alastair, do you want to have a first go?
Yeah. Okay. We'll sort of batten it. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, it's obviously a really interesting thing, because technology can be used for anything, right? As we've seen, technology can be used for massive centralization of power or for massive distribution of power, and often both, right? But things like WikiHouse and Mass Bespoke are an interesting, very practical sort of illustration, if you like, of things that wouldn't have been possible before the web, really. So the idea being that, that traditionally when we talked about things like factories, organizations or companies, we needed basically bigger was better, right? You needed a big company in order to organize. And now that's not necessarily true. And in the case of WikiHouse and Mass Bespoke, the traditional idea that a factory was a big thing with a lot of workers requiring a lot of capital. So the idea that, well, actually maybe with a digital fabrication machine, you can set up a small factory in a garage and a community can own that factory. And then actually they can make houses that fit together really, really quickly. And actually you can build a little ecosystem of local small businesses doing that. There's a literal diagram there. And that's, so I guess that's one of the kind of, sort of spanning between the detail and the abstract. Sort of that's one of the things I think is really interesting about democracy, is that we talk about democracy in terms of, as you say, deliberation and institutions for how we kind of all manage to rub along together as human beings. But there's also another dimension to democracy, which is the very literal one, which is to what extent, where does power lie, right? So there's the idea of democracy as a diagram. So a 1,000 rooftops with a solar panel each is a different diagram than a single power station generating all the power and sending it to 1,000 houses, but it's the same number of kilowatts involved. And it's the same idea with things like factories and stuff like that. So basically, in a very practical sense, is if used right, obviously web and the digital technology have this cool ability to put tools in our hands that simply weren't there, tools for organizing, tools for designing, tools for making, tools for debating, that simply wouldn't have been there for previous generations. And that seems like a cool way, a cool thing to use, basically.
I would just add a couple of things to this. One is how much of the past thinking is completely relevant still. So the idea of means of production being in the hands of a community, a community owning their own small factory, to be able to fabricate a whole range of things, from homes to community centers to little tiny homes to furniture, actually being able to work at it, have their own supply chain, which is also secular and local, be able to train people, use both older and younger people in that production system. This is something very powerful about placemaking, having means of build it yourself. And that has not been possible for a long time, that way of thinking. I'm surprised how potent that idea is. We are working on 3 emerging hubs like this, 3 emerging factories. Each one is done completely different approach. Each one is from bottom up. So Bristol one, I think you all know about, we're now working on Weekend Fab. We are working on a community factory that's going to be using 3 digital systems with local community to create little extensions, additions, new homes in the neighborhood. The one in Leeds has been instigated by artists. It's a cultural movement, cultural organization, East Leeds Pavilion, wanting to build a makerspace and a factory, again for the same purpose, to give the community new tools. And even now, we begin to discuss possibility of also developing something like this in Leeds, because there's enough communities, and it's community land trusts who are driving this. Now, they are by far the most innovative community organizations at the moment, who are not just taking risks, but also really understand how integrated everything is. Climate crisis, racial justice, social justice, that this is all part of the same conversation. So yes, I think there is a lot of hope in digital tools in terms of how we can democratize our systems. I'm just aware, Charlotte, how many people, I can see the names, everybody on this board has a view. And also Phil is chatting to you, and it's distracting me because we're having 2 conversations going on here. I just wonder whether it would be good to bring other people in.
I was going to ask the same thing about, at this point, does it feel right to bring everyone else in? And if, I don't know if there's the facility for people to raise their hand with their little, the little cartoon hand. The conversation in the chat, there's another Charlotte in there. That's not me.
Okay. Amazing. I thought you were amazing. You were able to write.
If only I could multitask like that. So I'd be very grateful if perhaps people could wave, or so we haven't got 20 people trying to ask a question at once, and I will do my best to bring them in. Anyone waving at me?
Jeff wants to talk.
Right. Fire away, please.
Okay. I spent the 1970s in Leeds School of Architecture. And I also lived in a nice little terrace street just off Heslington Road. And I diverted a student party to show my street. I don't think they were that impressed, actually. In the 1970s, it didn't have so many cars, so it was rather nicer. Now, they wanted to do, Corbusier stuff. Even then, I think he's gone out of fashion now, thank goodness. But shortly after, Oscar Newman came to the school, the defensible space guy. And I asked him about building housing because, I rated our little terrace street much better than many of the architect stuff I'd seen. And he said, he said, go out and look and find what you think is the best housing and try and do 5% better. Now, that model wasn't so much a collaborative model. It was a model of looking at the market to see which has been successful, and try and repeat it. And I think it's sad to, you look at the disasters that Jane Jacobs got rid of, and the Bellevue Street was due to be knocked down in the 1947 plan and replaced by Quarry Hill, which wasn't as bad as some of the things that followed. And Quarry Hill was knocked down. Sorry, did I say that? And prefabs were very happily. Many people were very happy in prefab, so that was a success. Terrace streets was a success. Multi-story housing more or less failed, and certainly it'd be no garden in lockdown is a bad thing. So should we be thinking more about a choice model where people choose where to live when they find what they want to live, and make the market rather broader, and look at the evidence? It seems to be not many architects. Sorry, I shouldn't be. Perhaps I used to think that. Perhaps I may have softened. What they want is the picture of their building in AR or AD or the Architect's Journal. They don't go back and look and see what happened afterwards. I did some tenancy turnover. No, forget that. That was the question. Should we have, rather than a complicated collaborative system, something where you've got a range of good design stuff that people can choose from, and is based on experience of how successful they were?
Could I maybe bring David back in?
That sounds like a good model. I sort of wanted to go back to what Helen was saying, actually, which is, I can link back in, I'm sure I can. I've got a friend in Manchester who stood for election at the last local elections with the Direct Democracy Party. And he said that every decision he was asked to make at the council, he would do by an internet poll of the electorate. And when we debated this, we decided this wasn't going to produce considered or even very sort of it could lead to some slightly extreme decisions. And we know if we did that nationally, we'd have hanging, for example. Still, I think we've got to be careful about direct democracy. We have representative democracy for a good reason, which is that we mediate the views of the public through their elected representatives, and that is generally a moderating process. And we've seen that with what's happening with social media at the moment and the election of extremist rulers across the globe. So I think we need to be careful. Now, this lunchtime, the Academy of Urbanism had a set of presentations on our towns, the series of towns we're looking at, and we had one from Frome, which was really interesting because in Frome they've abolished politics. So Frome Council doesn't have any political parties involved in it. So basically what happens is every community decides on 3 people they want to represent their views to the council, and they send them off based upon their ability to represent the views of the community, and they do that, which seems to me what representative democracy was always supposed to be about. You're electing people you trust to represent your views. And I think then difficult, because the problem with what Jeff was saying is that the same, I mean, again, a story, we did a workshop with the community up in Glasgow as part of the Glass House, and people living in tower blocks in Glasgow, we were asking them about what future housing they wanted, and they threw away all the pictures we gave to them of our sort of mood board of potential things, and they brought in all the stuff from Barrett's, from the property press, and said, we want those. We want cul-de-sacs and semi-detached houses. And it's a difficult conversation to say that actually that's not what you want, because who are you to say what they actually want? But actually, you know that people in a Glasgow living in a Barrett cul-de-sac, it ain't going to work. And so you've got to mediate these direct views in some way, which is a difficult process.
Oscar Newman did say, find the best that did work and repeat. And it seems to me that there's not enough investigation of how successful housing is.
Oh,
I mean, if you look at a street, do you know how many friends people have? Can you look at the and relate that to the architecture?
But I mean, I think this is where deliberative approaches to democracy are an important part of the mix, because I mean, direct democracy in terms of the kind of polling approach, the referendum kind of approach you're talking about in the example you gave, David, is kind of well, blunt to say the least, and causes some of the polarization that you were talking about. I suppose we've been very interested to think about how you draw on a mix of different democratic traditions to create a deliberative and democratic system, and that's what we're really trying to work on at the moment. And that includes, you know, both expanding what could be counted as like a political contribution, so it's not just reasoned argument, but nevertheless bringing in people's ideas and wishes and hopes and dreams into a conversation which is tested. So it's not just about assertion, have your say, just gathering of opinion that then get calibrated. It's actually a process where people's views can be expanded, exposed to new ideas, different kinds of expertise and ways of knowing can be drawn in, and then from that, ways forward can be established. So I think there is a kind of a richer repertoire of democratic tradition that can be combined in helpful ways, potentially, in the kinds of debates that we're talking about.
How would you deal with people? How would you deal with people like me that don't want to live next to motorists? If you're doing a collaborative approach, 70% of them want a car. Often they find out that if you have too many cars, it's awful and they don't want to live there. But we need a richer range of choices, and just this technique of asking people, doesn't that give the average, the committee camel?
So I'm chair of our local community organisation in Whalley Range. We call the Whalley Rangers, and we have about 3,000 people on our Facebook page, and so I had this argument with Angeliki Stodger, who's our local councillor, and she says, well, no, I got a majority of 6,500 when I was elected, so I definitely speak for more people than you do, and she's right in a way. I mean, she speaks for all the people who don't come to our meetings or don't get involved in our Facebook page and so on. And actually, it's quite important to have that wider representation, because the people who take the time to get involved are always the minority. They're never the majority involved in even deliberative democracy, which I do have a lot of sympathy for, Helen. As in sort of people's panels and stuff like that. I think it's very valuable, but it's always the minority who are involved. And representative democracy has a much greater reach in terms of the involvement in it.
If I may, I think there's a question here which is sort of possibly these things are cross purposes to each other, because there's also the question in the first place of what decisions need to be made centrally and which decisions don't be, right? Because if a decision doesn't need to be made centrally, then the deliberation doesn't need to happen. So, obvious example, if you've been involved in community housing, would be, should we all have identical houses, in which case we all need to get in the room and actually argue with each other about whether we want the bathroom to be here or there? Or do we all say, no, we'll design the street together, but then each of us designs our own house because actually it's easy for us to do that? So I think there is probably another dimension to this conversation, which you may be kind of going past each other on, which is that, there's also there's both the deliberative mechanisms, and this is, one of the inherent problems of the notion of localism, is that in a functioning democracy, some decisions should be taken at a national scale, some decisions should be taken at a sort of regional scale, some should be taken at a neighbourhood scale, and some should be taken at the scale of an individual or a family. And by the way, probably some should be taken at a global scale. And I think, it's when you sort of get them muddled up that things tend to go wrong. The interesting opportunities we have is to kind of use knowledge in a different way. And so I think, when you were talking, Jeff, one of the things that majorly popped into my mind was Christopher Alexander and the pattern language. you know, I think we're really, you know, we're into digital technology, and we're really, really interested in the idea of patterns, which were the idea of these replicable design patterns that echo through history, and you can actually map data to them. And we actually, historically, the professions have done a pretty bad job of doing this. They've tried, but we haven't done a very good job. You know, but we know certain things, like, you know, when you put a patient in a hospital bed with a view of trees, they have measurably faster recovery rates. We know that if you put a cycle lane on protected cycle lanes on roads, people drive less and air pollution gets better. We've got data to prove that stuff. So there's a really, it doesn't have to always be about top-down power, because actually, you know, one of our questions we're asking ourselves a lot at the moment, which is in the same way that with WikiHouse, we say, right, let's fully open source it and let people adapt it. What if we were to build knowledge institutions, collaborative knowledge institutions, where we put these patterns out there and begin to map this data around a common open pool, if you like, of these sorts of patterns. And actually that actually is quite a cool thing, because those patterns are things that everybody, professionals, exactly as you were talking about, David, you know, both professionals and non-professionals can get around those patterns. And actually we can say, look, there's this particular thing, you know, we don't know why it works, that when you put a little plant space or plant pots outside each other's houses, well, we do, but, you know, I mean, we don't know why it works, but it does work. So actually, and people like it. So I think there's a lot of room in the middle of these conversations.
Have you ploughed your way through his book? It's thick with you know, you'd think, can I find something that's relevant to me now? And you spend hours looking at it, and it was only really used. His method was only used once in building, wasn't it?
There's a really interesting
university
that,
campus,
which we shouldn't probably go into now, but it's really interesting, which is that basically it wasn't very popular with architects, that book, but it was hugely popular with computer programmers. And a lot of the coding languages that we use today were built with heavily reference from that work. So when we're interested in it and reading it, actually it's really interesting, because we feel like it's about time that the built environment borrowed back.
I suspect that was hot.
The idea of the open source, the shareware, is a catalyst of some kind, and it's sort of maybe latching on to some catalyst that then you say, you know, you can map, you can use that catalyst to grow. You know, it's a framework. So can we maybe touch on, I don't know, bring Victoria back in. What's been a catalyst in your work, or what framework has been really successful?
So I'm really interested in, I think, like Alastair, I think the merits of the deliberative versus representative democracy idea is, you know, which one is it for making which decisions? I think that's the right question. But the additional layer that I was thinking about during that conversation was, how can we use these new technologies and new ways of communicating, mass communication and mass and deliberation, actually, to enhance both of those and other types of decision making. So things like citizens' juries, which inevitably, you know, take quite a lot of time. You know, you're only going to have a very small number of people involved in them, because people have to come together at a certain point of time in a certain room generally. How can we take online platforms and change the way they work to involve a much wider range of people, or how can we change them so that we can bring people together at the critical point for the decision, but actually the consideration, the learning, everything else that happens alongside those to make them work can happen in a more distributed way, so people can, you know, a kind of, I suppose it's the OU of citizens' juries, you know, or something else like that. Things and comparable ideas that were popping into my head during that and earlier on when I was thinking about this today. Are things like I don't know if anybody is a teacher or as friends with, married to, whatever, a teacher, and use this app called Teacher Tap, which is, I think, daily 3 or 4 questions get sent to you, or I think you can also engage with it on Twitter. And ultimately there's a very very small but a reward for engaging with it on a consistent basis. But because it's a very large number of people that are engaging with it, it's really quite influential in shaping, not in shaping national policy, I don't think it might be, but in terms of how teachers and professionals are informing their own practice. You know, what are the equivalents to that, or what are the other ideas where, you know, if we're talking about design and landscape and housing and all those other things, you know, how can you involve very quickly large numbers of people? You know, here's 2 things, which one do you like better? Here's another 2 things, you know, because it's really fast-paced stuff. How can we adapt and incorporate some of those types of things? I'm not saying they're perfect, to help inform our practice, I suppose. Rather, again, a question rather than an answer. Apologies.
I can't see the audience, I'm afraid. I see a series of names with muted microphones and not the little hands.
I've got eyes on the little hands, so do you want me to?
I can't see the hands, I'm afraid, Rebecca.
Oh,
so there's no way I can ask people to speak.
Robert Powell has his hand up. If you want to ask a question, Robert.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca and Charlotte. Both David and Alastair have referred to national things at the moment. I'm quite interested in putting the conversation we've been having into a sense of what might be coming at us in terms of the government white papers on planning. David, you referred to the fact you were working on a national design code, which is mentioned in the white paper as something that they are promoting or thinking of. I mean, I'm reassured that you're involved in it, but the idea of a national design code, you know, strikes terror into a lot of people. And Alastair, you mentioned something around public consultation, which is more apt, I suppose, to what we're talking about now. And you seem to be thinking sort of positively about things being said in terms of some sort of new normal around public consultation. And that's also referred to in the white paper, although it seems to be upfront in the process and not throughout the process. So I just wonder whether either of you can shed any light on the white papers and the risks and benefits that you see.
Shall I go first? I'm not supposed to talk about this. Because we're working on the National Urban Design Code. As part of that, we're not supposed to talk about the planning white paper, but the consultation is now finished, hasn't it? It went in, finished yesterday, so I'm surely I can. So last year, York Design Week, I talked about my book Climax City, and essentially what that argued was that we should use a approach to the master planning of sites and also the planning of cities, which allowed them to self-organize. And that they did that. You did that by creating a frame, an acceptable frame into which that self-organization can happen. The planning white paper basically does that. The planning white paper is basically a version of a planning system, which is what most of the rest of the world use. And as part of the code, we've looked at what France does and what America does and what Germany and various other places Australia do. And basically, it would put us in line with the way everywhere else does planning. I mean, we're the exception that allows fairly junior planning officers complete discretion over something when it's applied. The idea of a code is that you have a set of parameters and it's judged by that. And if you meet the parameters, you have a guarantee that you'll get consent, and if you don't, you have a guarantee that you'll get refused. It takes the uncertainty out of the process. It also, as you imply, Robert, takes the democracy out of the process, which is where the risk lies. And the response to that is twofold. The first is to say that the development of the code should be an intensely democratic process. So the way in which it's drawn up is something which involves as wider people as possible. That's all well and good. Of course, the problem is that people won't necessarily engage with something when they don't understand the direct relevance to them. And they'll only understand that direct relevance when someone wants to build something next to their home. And so, in other words, it'll be too late by that point. The second point, however, is more important, which is that the deemed consent that you get by meeting the code is the equivalent of an outline planning consent in our system. So you'd still need to put reserve matters in our system. And so we had a very interesting case study we did with in Boston. And so Catherine Firth, who some of you will know, who's been working on the urban design code for Boston, says that if you meet the code, you get automatic consent for your development, but you then need to design it, and you need to consult on the design, and the community are involved in the design of the thing, and you have design panels and consultation and so on the design of the thing. The issue being that the principle's been established. And so I actually don't think it's a bad idea. The problem is it's being put forward by a Conservative government who also think permitted development rights are a good idea. And so you read, obviously, the planning reform with the PD mirror or lens, and you assume it's not going to work, and it's meant without good intentions. But actually, if you read the words, it's pretty much exactly what I've been suggesting should happen.
Yeah, I can shut up if you want.
I was just going to say we were scheduled to finish at 8. I've just been asking Rebecca what we want to do in terms of sticking to time or running on a little bit. And I think, given I couldn't see anyone wanting to ask questions, we ought to run on a little bit if it's okay with people, but people can duck out as and when they want to, I suppose. So we're planning on a little bit of an extension, if that's okay with our panel.
Yeah. May I come in on that question? That I have a long answer to that question, but it's very, very long. In fact, I've just posted the link because I just because the deadline for the consultation was yesterday. I was furiously writing an 8,000 word response to the planning white paper yesterday. Broadly, I agree with a lot of what David just said. Thanks, Rebecca. My fingers hurt. Yeah, I mean, actually, like you're saying about consultation. Oddly enough, I mean, let's face it. I broadly think that the shift towards what I've been advocating for a long time, is moving towards what I call a more rules-based planning system. Now, I actually think that it's not getting rid of democracy at all. It's actually a fantastic thing for democracy, because what we're doing is moving democracy upstream, not downstream of the process. Right, it's really weird that we talk ourselves doing consultation in planning. Actually, the thing most consultation happens on is actually not planning, it's development control, which is in theory testing against the planning framework. But the planning framework has been so, because we have this sort of discretionary system, it's been so consumed in this oppositional thing. And therefore, for most of us, if we have any engagement at all in the planning system, it's this deeply adversarial thing where, frankly, it's a fait accompli. The developer, whether it be a speculative developer or whoever, has already paid their money, they've already had their designs, everything is high stakes at this point. And so we have this sort of joke of consultation where actually an awful lot of consultation that's gone on, we all instinctively understand that it's not really going to change the basic economics of the scheme. It's like choosing what color brick you'd like to be hit around the head with, because fundamentally the same basic outcomes are going to occur. Whereas actually doing that, if you like, consultation upstream of the planning codes being created, and then saying, no, that's actually the code now you just have to kind of go with that, is actually bring like, well, how do we do this? Do we do this where there's a central plan and that we have to have consultation on the central plan? Well, partially yes, right? Because but I think the thing David hit on is exactly right, which is about the future of institutions is moving away from this idea of we're going to do this to you, what do you think, towards we can create a framework for federated power with limits, within which many bottom-up activities can happen. And I think that's certainly what we've been pushing for, is the relation of the proposal set out in this white paper, is to say, actually, it will be really cool if we could sort of set certain national parameters, then set certain local parameters, but then if they wish to, communities can actually make a local plan, a neighborhood plan, and that neighborhood plan can literally be set could even be set as far as not just in a neighbourhood, but it could even be set into what's the local development order, which literally means it's not even, there isn't even reserved matters beyond it, right? Potentially, it could literally be, as long as you're within this design code, you can keep adapting your house or whatever it is within these very tight constraints. So that would be kind of really interesting, because you could say, yeah, okay, to that neighborhood, you don't get control. You don't get to say no one comes to live in your neighborhood, right? You don't get to do the NIMBY thing, but you do get to say what that development might feel and look like, and etc., and be part of before it happens. And I actually think there's real advantages to the before it happens thing. Is I think it was it John Stuart Mill or Bentham or one of that lot who had this concept of the veil of ignorance. So actually it's really cool to come up with sorts of neighborhood codes before, if you like, before you know which side you're going to be on. And actually there's actually some quite good stuff about that. And obviously we're really interested in how you can facilitate that, those sorts of tools, or that sort of approach to planning simply wouldn't have been possible when the planning system was conceived in 1948, because it had to be run as this paper-based bureaucracy. Now we have the web to use as our operating medium. Can we do it differently? Can we do it? Can we structure it in this much more democratic framework way? And there's going to be lots that's going to go wrong along the way. And as you say, there's a real issue of trust, frankly, given who's delivering it. But there's an awful lot to be excited about, I think.
Thank you both.
I take some questions from the floor, although I can't see any hands. I did wonder, there's some people, there's one hand, maybe from the bottom here. We've got a few people. We've got 2 pages of people. Would people, Emma, we've got at the bottom, Claire, Chris Bailey. Would any of you like to chip in, please? Anyone there?
I will.
Yes, please.
I think it's Emma. I'll take my video off as well, actually. We'll put it on. Hello. It's all been very, very, I sort of work quite a lot in communities, and I recognise that most people don't know how decisions are made. I do a lot of work where people don't know where rates go, what's national, what's local. And it kind of tells out there's not much in the way of education at school, informally or formally. And so I think we sort of have a fairly consumerist mindset as to what we expect to happen to us, what services we expect to be delivered. And I really feel that with some of the data stuff that you've been talking about, we could be much more playful and creative in how we bring to life our physical public realm. So obviously we could look at things like wikis. I'm quite interested in your points of view of whether that would lead to sort of really bad information as well, or bad actors. So I do appreciate that not all data, there will be moderation, etc. needed in that. But how do we sort of tell the story of objects, everyday objects, roads, benches, the things that we encounter all the time in such a way that they don't just seem invisible to us? How did they come to be here? How were they funded? How do we, you know, what's happened here before? So I think there's a beautiful opportunity to take some of that data and allow creative kind of response to that, which could, you know, not rolled out across the country. Every community could look at it differently, really. I would particularly love to sort of be able to go up to an empty plot of land with my shipping containers and say, well, that's not going to be built on anytime soon, and it's been empty for about 10 years. Could I just plonk a shipping container like a good old pirate and get away with it without asking for permission? So I really think this sort of code stuff is saint sport and grown up, but the pirate bit of me kind of goes, well, what happens if we just do something and find out? So I think some legibility in the public realm, which gives us some sense of like, this is owned by this, you know, offshore investment, has nothing to do with this local neighborhood, go for it, because what are they going to do? You know, that would be great. So how do we go from this kind of digital knowledge, or this tacit knowledge that we talk about, to actually shared knowledge? So that I think would be a mass, you know, beautiful project to get everybody involved in. I'm now blushing. I don't know why. This seems to really matter to me, this particular thing, which is making knowledge more shareable, more sort of experienced.
I could just quickly answer Emma, because we tried to do this. No, we had a big project in Leeds trying to bring all the data of land ownership onto a community map. And what we found is that it's knowledge which is really protected, and it's in different places. And the digital is not one thing. Digital has many different files, many different forms, and it's very bitty and it's very out of date. And we very quickly found that there were many problems with this, with that kind of information being revealed. But totally agree with you that knowing who owns what is pretty fundamental question in terms of open democracy. If we don't know, if we don't see the mechanism behind our places, we can't really participate to our full ability.
I'm aware, Irena, I love the project, and I kind of kept hoping that sort of the mapping bit would start to, I suppose it's quite an involved process, and I think perhaps it's time to revisit, or, you know, can we just be more guerrilla about putting QR codes up which link to a wiki or something, so it doesn't have to all be perfect, but the sort of little action by many sort of approach to it. I'd be so up for doing something like that.
I think the time is right, Emma. The time is right.
Yeah, let's do it.
Alistair, do you have comments on this? Because I've seen you clapping and getting excited. And...
No, I'm just all over. I mean, you bridge so many things there, but you're exactly right. The one is the doing it, you know, just do it bit. And actually, you know, I love that there's lots of amazing histories about, even before the web, there are amazing examples of histories for opening up closed knowledge, so to give people tools to do this kind of thing. You know, things that was, I think gay people there was an organization used to give gay people these cards so that if they were ever arrested, it told them they had their legal rights to hand. So they had essentially a lawyer in their pocket if they were arrested. This was before, you know, back in the 50s, before the legalization of homosexuality, and you know, there's this long history of if like people doing this, kind of working out how to share knowledge to facilitate that. And there's loads of stuff. I mean, it's something that we're really passionate about, you know, and not a lot of people know. I don't know if this is a good thing or not. Not a lot of people know that if, for example, as long as you don't try to hide it, as long as you kind of do a thing in planning, that it's actually the council will have to prove that it's not in the public interest, but B, also if no one enforces you for 4 years, then it's done anyway, right? So there are various rooms into the system for doing this, and I think good systems in the future should deliberately make room for that kind of activity. And nothing kind of crushes my soul more when you have that situation where a community, you know, outside some housing have started doing some community gardening, and then along come council's estates contractor and say, no, this is unlawful use of this space, and they get the mowers and they mow out all that community grass. But I think it's all about, you know, try and do what you mentioned. In my thing I talked about earlier, I mentioned a quite serious branch of this amazing piece of history called chattel houses, which is when in the plantations and in the kind of post abolitionist era in America, when these incredibly exploitative plantation owners and landlords used to try and exploit the workers, they came up with these kit houses so they could, in the event that the landlord was exploiting them, they could very rapidly disassemble the house and move onto a different piece of land. And using that mechanism, they sort of began to try and fight back against this kind of abusive power. And then over time, what happens is that becomes more normal. The more people see that, and people have an instinct for natural justice. And hopefully over time, people go, actually, instead of that being against the system, why don't we make that the system?
Can I bring Phil Bixby in? He's right in the middle of the screen as well. Just because you're doing some chatting about ideas rather than decisions, which I thought was quite interesting. And is that what Alistair's talking about, perhaps, or Emma? You know, that there's something that people do that becomes a sort of a tangible idea that people can then get behind. You're on mute, I think, Phil.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Right. I guess the point I was making was about, I mean, it's interesting, a lot of this evening's conversation, I mentioned earlier in the chat, is about kind of democracy in relation to decisions rather than democracy in relation to planning and thinking and making visions of the future. And I guess, so I suppose one of the things I was, the reason I made that point was about, because we don't tend to have this kind of constant background kind of churn of thinking about what we want to happen, we just kind of go from decision to decision to decision to decision, and people are pushed into a point where they have to kind of jump one way or t'other, and we don't developing ideas. And somebody else made a really good comment in the chat about the idea of creating a kind of public space where maybe conflicting or different kind of, you know, diverging ideas can coexist, and we don't have to always kind of jump onto one or the other. And that maybe that's something we need to think more about. And certainly, you know, the work Helen and I have been doing has been very much about, rather than a kind of straightforward, you know, what do you want here? It's about how do we create a vision, and how do we then move forward in a deliberative way to work out what works, and how do you kind of bring forward an idea of active citizenship so that people don't simply kind of vote every 4 years and then get agitated when the house next door to them is about to be demolished, but where people are thinking all the time about how do they want their city to be in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. So yeah, the power of ideas as being something that we maybe undervalue, and we don't spend enough time kicking around in a kind of civilized, non-bubble way.
Thank you, Phil. Rebecca, is there anyone else that would like to speak who hasn't yet?
I'm sure they probably are. Let me just have a look through this. Steph from, I think that might be Steph from Growing Green Spaces, but I'm not entirely sure. Do you want to chip in? Because you're always great at chipping in. And there's a question here about the Hello Lamppost thing. Go.
Yes. Chipping in at a point where I've just made a slightly arsey comment. I'm just kind of, I suppose, wondering a bit more broadly about I think Emma's comments about how data could be this really empowering thing and kind of increase literacy about land and about this information that's kind of concealed from us. But I'm also just kind of I don't know how, I suppose, yeah, since there are lots of experts here, how do things like this work? It seems to me it's just creating a body of commodifiable data about the way people use space.
Well, I like to answer this question because one of my biggest professional shocks that I've experienced was when I was getting involved in planning in Leeds, and I asked Leeds City Council for data about land ownership. And after a long time, without being able to access anything, I finally was given a paper map. And everything that belonged to the council was in red. And I would say that I still got this map. It's one thing I will never, ever throw away. I would say about 60 to 70% of the land of Leeds was in local authority ownership. And we don't understand this because a lot of it is housing estates, a lot of it is, social housing, a lot of it has been, sublet or rented or whatever. So it's not actually available as such, but it is in common ownership. And I think there has been a lot of selling of it going on, but local authorities still own huge amounts of land. So I think mapping is a very powerful tool because you get to see things that you simply did not see before. It can be, yeah. So yeah, making things visible. Now, if you can make carbon visible, we'll all be behaving differently. So it's about visibility.
And it's worth saying that there's very real legal hard-nosed practices behind this stuff about licenses and proprietary ownership models for these data sets. So making sure that open data like that gets out under an open license. So actually, for example, there's a lot of reasons involved why it's not possible to look up and understand who owns a given site in the UK right now. But a lot of them have to do with things like land registry it wasn't privatized, but it has got, essentially they treats those data sets as proprietary because it's not funded to do anything else. So it sells our own data back to us, etc. And actually there's support across the political board for changing that. It's just being very slow. So, you know, the sort of things like IP licenses and the governance and ownership of the organizations and the movements behind these things is really, really important. And that's how we structure them, to make sure that they get them out of ideally proprietary ownership, and they become collective institutions.
I'd just add to that. I think if we don't know that data exists, generally speaking, we're not going to ask for it. So the bit about literacy and learning is like, we don't get taught this at school. We feel quite apathetic about the places we live in. We think it's done to us. So it doesn't occur to us that actually we could have some rights. I also think, to Irena's point of when you see an entire map, it takes that NIMBYist kind of mindset out a little bit as well, because for example, I've just moved to a more affluent area after 20 years of living in an area of so-called disadvantage. And you can see how quickly you become seduced by the kind of place identity and the social capital, and everybody can put on their events. And I compare it to like last year, I was thinking, actually, this is light years away. I'm caring about free school meals in the place I've just moved to. But actually what we do is push problems down the road. So the kind of strength of the voice of professional people within the new community I'm in is so much more articulate than the place I used to live for 20 years. But you can see how planning decisions will become, well, not in our backyard, let's move it close to the city centre. We don't actually, as citizens, kind of think beyond our little neighbourhood. So we become very kind of attached to that neighbourhood place thing, and not about how does this affect the next ward and the next ward. But we're happy to support free school meals, but we're not actually kind of happy to understand that every little decision we make can impact another ward across the other part of the city. And I think until we see that data, we don't actually get an accurate picture of it. And of course, not everybody's going to have time or capacity to care about that. But the more we can actually just normalize it and say, if we do that here, what will it mean to another part of that town or that city? And if we don't get taught that at school, it's never going to be part of our questioning. So I think there's such a big job to do to make this a kind of civics again. It's back to, don't get taught civics at school.
Helen, do you want to come into that? Because just with your wealth.
Oh, just nodding, really. I mean,
there you are.
I mean, I think absolutely, like thinking about the connectivity, because the point is that any of our actions aggregate to create all sorts of unpredictable effects, and that is basically what our cities are, isn't it? The complexity of this complex system of place that is not bounded within a locality, whether that's a neighbourhood or actually at city boundaries. And so trying to think about the complexity of the places we're in through being within them, through being exposed to other people's perspectives from multiple perspectives, and trying to connect up those conversations in a meaningful way that then inform both individual choices but also ultimately bigger formal decisions is really important. So yeah, I was just absolutely supporting what you were saying there.
Okay, I think we need to perhaps wrap it up. Do you, Rebecca?
We can do so. I feel like Jeff wants to say something. Come on, Jeff.
Two quick things. I've got some tenancy turnover data from the 1970s here. If anyone knows how to read it, I'd like to know, because I think it's quite important that tenancy turnover rates do tell you something about an area. And the other quick point is, why was David so interested in building on brownfield sites? Shouldn't we turn them into green spaces? We've got plenty of land around all our cities, possibly not Kensington, but most of them. There's plenty of land, so let's build on it.
Go on, David.
A whole new argument there, Jeff, which is a session entirely in its own right. Yeah.
I had a question about the brownfield site that you were talking about, though. It was way back on the chat. This chat's been amazing, by the way, everyone. Very well done. Nearly as well. No, it's as exciting as last night's BML Pirate chat, which was pretty pretty good. But I was wanting to know, what was it on the brownfield site that the residents were so opposed against, and what yeah, just that dynamic between you as an urban designer and the community there. Like, why were you so in such a disagreement with them?
It was in Sunderland, is the first thing to say, which actually is a very fractious community. Didn't surprise me that Sunderland was the biggest majority for Brexit in the country. There's a level of trust that's been lost there. What they didn't like is other people, which is really sad to say. So when you're working, actually, if you suggest jobs, people like jobs. They have no problem about jobs because they assume the jobs are for them or for their people and relatives and so on. They build houses, they assume they're for other people, and they're scared of other people, which is really sad, but that's the way it is. And you find that all over the country, that when you suggest housing, people are opposed because they don't know who's going to live there. And the middle class communities think it's going to be social housing, and the social housing communities think it's going to be yuppies or whatever. Other people are scary. That's what's so upsetting about the whole process.
So is there some space then maybe to create a bit more of a shared language between people so that we can communicate better with one another, that just sort of builds more of a bridge between, because obviously we need more housing.
Yeah.
And
I think it probably goes deeper than that, though, doesn't it? In a sense, because fundamentally the thing that they're expressing, and this is a general thing we can say about where do populist movements get their fuel from, is like essentially it's the initial starting belief that there isn't enough for everyone, right? And that's a classic difference between different groups of people, is if you believe that there is enough for everyone, whereas if you believe there isn't. And so if you believe that there isn't enough for everyone, then it means that new people coming to your neighborhood are going to take your hospitals or take your schools or whatever it is, right? Now, and actually it's not really for us to say they're wrong, because actually for in a lot of those areas, probably their experience is that there isn't enough for everyone, because that's the way that systems have actually failed them. So I think the idea, I mean, yes, of course we should be trying to build bridges, but unfortunately, I think there's a bigger, longer economic story. Obviously, I would say land and land feudalism is a huge part of that story. The fact that we still have this feudal land system, and I think I think it's also one of the things we have to be really mindful of in these conversations is yes, the key thing is, God, we all need to remember that we're all humans, and God knows we need to make better space for deliberative talking through things and meeting each other and empathizing. But actually there's also some underlying stuff to do where we have to make sure that we go out and build systems and environments and frameworks for society where actually more and more people do feel that there is enough for everyone.
So I suggested this to Charlotte just on private chat earlier, but I wondered if each of you could give us a bit of a summary or a roundup of what you think would be a really good action for creating this more deliberative future, or the more wherever we are. What the whole conversation has been so deep and complex and very grown up, as Emma was saying, but about but could you each give a little nugget at the end just to round up the conversation this evening? David, you first.
So good to be first. I haven't got a nugget.
Send it over to someone. Let's play ping pong.
Helen, you're next to me. Go on, you can give a nugget.
I think there's something that I've really enjoyed about this conversation, which is about the relationship between structures for connection between people over scale and scope, and capacity for action and agency. And I sort of saw that pattern in a number of different of the interchanges. So I think that is what we're trying to do, isn't it? Try to create the means by which we can connect across space and scale and scope, but at the same time enable action and agency within your lives, within your neighbourhoods, and ultimately within your cities. So for me, there's a sort of nugget there about agency and structure, which is an old sort of like theoretical and political sort of chestnut, but I think a lot of what we've been circulating around is how to design that, how to make that happen, what kind of processes would work for that. That's as nuggety as I can get at this time on a Friday night.
I've got a nugget that builds on what Helen just said, because it's specific. So Helen, you laid out the theory, and I've got a specific nugget, which is really directed at Rebecca. You have started something major with the York Design Week. You really have. And I'm a great believer in theory of change, really big believer. And I think this is what you have started. You have started the process of change. And I think my nugget would be that you will design this this new democratic way of being in York at your next year's York Design Festival, that you make it the subject of your next festival.
Okay. See how we go. Victoria?
I'll build on Helen's point as well, actually, because I think that idea of how do you build those two things, how do you design those two things into getting people more engaged in using, shaping, making decisions about enjoying the parks and green spaces where they live, and in particular, how can we design things to attract, engage, involve, encourage people who generally aren't particularly involved in those decision-making forums or shaping forums, even though they might be active users. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
So from user to active engagement.
Yeah, and some of the non-users as well, I think. But I think, you know, parks are broadly pretty do an okay job at attracting diverse audiences, and certainly room for improvement, but they do an okay job. But if you look at the people that are shaping what happens in them, and these groups do a very good job in many cases of standing up for their parks, but you look at them and they are a very, very specific demographic. Not the demographics of the people using the park. So how can we change that, I think?
That's a really good question. Alastair?
I'm a bit stymied by this. There's been so many interesting threads to this conversation, and I've had a beer. I'm a lightweight, really.
I've had lemon with wine.
Yeah. I think that we have a kind of Irena said, kind of theory of change, which is a kind of recognition that there's a really interesting thing going on right now, where an awful lot of people realize that the systems that we're all working within are kind of a bit broken, and we all have this tendency to go and bash someone over the head about it. But the reality is that everybody else is also working somewhere in that system, or is also scared of losing something, or has also not got enough time, or is, you know, so, and it's so often that you say, well, we, of course, you know, stuff that's really obvious, like, of course local authorities should be using the land which is ours and these small sites to try and get them out there under kind of, you know, new forms of ownership or community ownership or whatever it might be. But it's really, really difficult for them, because the system that, even though privately they believe with, they agree with you, the whole sort of system that's around them in their day-to-day lives isn't designed to help them, to allow them to do that. And the job, you know, our job is to recognize that, right? Don't blame the players, look at the game that they're in. And then from every level, it's saying, well, how can we make it easier for you? Right? How can, and it sounds, you know, it sounds a bit reductionist, but that kind of is what we're really, really interested in. You know, with WikiHouse, we've found, you know, the emotional transformative effect it has when people realize they can build a house for themselves, and actually when they invite their friends to do it for them. Like, you can't do that if you don't have construction skills. If you don't have construction skills, you can't do that unless you make it really so easy that anyone can do it. And in fact, you can't invite your friends to help you build a house unless it's so quick that you can do it in a weekend, because your friends are like, look, I can't I can't come and help you for 2 weeks, but I can come and help you for a weekend, and then we'll have a lovely meal at the end of it, and we built a house, and our friendship is cemented for life, and God, we feel powerful, right? So actually, by lowering a threshold, by making it easier, we can begin to chip away and change, allow people to live out what they already believe. And you know, same basic trick that we're trying with Plan X. So you know, it's one of the first services we've built with Plan X is a thing called Find Out If You Need Planning Permission. So if you're fortunate enough to own your house and you want to put an extension on it or whatever it is, you want to find out, do you need planning permission to do that thing? At the moment, to do that requires at least several hours of digging through various different websites and documents, and probably paying a consultant or something like that. And we found a way that of getting that, writing that information, that legal information, as machine readable code. So you can go on your phone and you can say, where is your property, where's your postcode, what you want to do, and it will tell you in a couple of minutes all the law that applies to that thing that you want to do. So we're on the same game of saying, how can we make it easier, just that little bit easier? And I think that's the only takeaway I can possibly offer for this, really, is that there's a hard-nosedness to trying to kind of lower those thresholds, and out the other side of that kind of hard-nosed sort of engineering down of difficulty, hopefully becomes that liberates a world of lovely, complex interactions and communications where we can all make more time for each other and listen a bit harder.
I think that's an excellent nugget, Alastair. David, you're going to have the final word with your nugget, and then we're going to say goodbye.
Exactly what I engineered, you see. It always worries me when I talk in these forums against community participation, because it's what we do. And the thing that always struck me was when Cameron introduced localism, you suddenly realize that localism was quite a right-wing thing, because it was giving power to the articulate, and it was giving power to the powerful and disempowering the people without power. And it seems to me, as Alastair said before, local democracy, local freedom to express what you do needs a frame. It needs a frame, and that frame can only be created by, it can't be bottom up. The frame can't be bottom up. The frame has to be created by something at a bigger level, which is why representative democracy is really important. And we need to, my nugget is, we need to reinvent representative democracy at the local level. And I've got a lot of time for Froome, having got rid of political parties, because the reason Angeliki, my local councillor, gets 6,500 votes, 4,500 of those are people who will always vote Labour. They're not voting on what Angeliki did, they're voting because they're Labour. And the same elsewhere. And I think if you got rid of party politics out of local democracy, you'd have a much richer conversation about someone who represents the views of that community.
I just love this conversation. I could just sit here and talk with everyone for such a long time. And thank you everyone so much for all of your inputs. The chat has been insanely amazing. I think we should maybe publish this chat as a blog post or something. It's been great. I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation next year, but tomorrow there's still some events happening. Phil and Helen are running Thinking York from the Villages at, I can't remember what time, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock. So you can get on that if you're York based, or if you're not York based and you just want to talk to these guys more, which why would you not want to? Thank you so much to Irena, Alastair, Victoria, Helen and David for the panel, and Charlotte for giving your time this evening, from York Architectural Association, Mass Architecture as well, and from just from everyone at York Design Week. Thank you so much for such a brilliant dynamic conversation. I've had a whale of a time. I hope to see you all soon. Let's carry on some of these into practice, and let's do this next week. Monday I'm on it. Let's talk, email people, email anyone, everyone, talk to each other. Let's do stuff.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.